Hello everyone. Sorry you can't see my face, but this is Isaiah Helms here just working on posting this beautiful radiology timeline for everyone. I hope you all had a good time learning this semester and researching and discovering new things in regards to the history of radiology. Without further ado, here is my presentation. So when we go back all the way as far as we can go into the 19th century, looking at the history in regard to imaging, radiology, imaging, medical imaging. We have the last 3 decades there in the 1800s to look at. I've got 3 different events there to highlight at the end of the 19th century there. 1873, excuse me. We get a new tube, cathode ray tube, from William Crookes. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen uses a Crookes tube to do his own experimentation, and he is the first person to publish his findings on X-rays. And then in 1896, right there at the close of the century, right after the discovery of Röntgen, we get already X-ray equipment being sold by GE and Siemens, because they're very old companies. And at that same time, we also see experimentation begin on burns and other negative side effects being seen from radiation exposure. People start to learn about that. So let's look at the Crookes tube first. So one of the neat things about our modern day tubes that we use is you can trace them all the way back to that time frame. William Crookes was able to figure out how to pump most of the air out of a vacuum, and then he put some metal plates within that vacuum and applied voltage, and he was able basically to put together a crude but functional X-ray tube. It did produce X-rays, even though it was very inefficient compared to what we have today. And it was functional enough that that's what Wilhelm Röntgen was able to use to study X-rays. They called X-ray tubes back then cathode rays. So we know today that the rays of energy that we use from electricity that produce the X-rays are electrons, but they didn't yet know that. Obviously, back then the atomic particles were yet undiscovered, so electrons was not a word that they would have used to describe what they were using back then, but they called them cathode rays instead of electron streams. Moving on, Röntgen used one of these kinds of tubes, which were neat because those plates glowed inside the tube there, and he did tons and tons of experiments with these tubes. He spent tons of time working with these tubes. He was kind of a madman of sorts, and he discovered that the energies, the rays, the photons that came from these tubes could actually go through things, and he could put his own bones and his wife's and beside these photons that were coming out of the cathode rays, and capture images on glass plates. And so he created the first X-rays that were captured on glass plates, and he published his findings. He's from Germany, and he published his findings to a local society there, medical society in Germany. And back then they didn't know what these rays of energy that were coming from these cathode ray tubes were. Therefore, he called them X-rays because they were unknown. And it's amazing to me to think, nowadays we kind of take for granted the electromagnetic spectrum to a degree. But it makes me curious, though, if there's a case in which maybe there are EM energies that we haven't discovered yet, because it wasn't that long ago really that we had no idea that X-rays even existed. So maybe there are more unknowns. Shortly after this, as X-ray equipment was becoming a huge thing, people were starting to realize that there was something dangerous about them, but they couldn't figure out quite what that was. Elihu Thompson was a guy who came along, and he actually worked for an electrical company. I believe it was GE, and he set out to prove, he had a theory that it wasn't the electricity that was causing these strange side effects that people were getting that worked with these X-ray tubes. His assumption was it was the X-rays themselves that came from the tubes. So he experimented with his own body. He aimed some of these X-rays at his little dip joint on his pinky finger. I believe it was the left pinky finger. And I think it was for 15 minutes, actually, he did that to see what would happen. And he did have some injuries to his pinky finger and the surrounding tissue there. And that was kind of one of those first ways that people could prove that radiation that came from Crookes tubes, X radiation, was harmful. So thank you, Elihu Thompson, and sorry about your pinky finger. Into the 20th century, we've got more people that helped us to understand X radiation and the dangers of it, like Elizabeth Fleischmann. But we also have advancements in the actual equipment that that they were using back then, and that we get to benefit from that today. Hollis Potter invents the oscillating grid in 1915. Arthur Mutscheller starts studying radiation dose. We'll get into that. And then in 34, Jean Kiefer, he builds Jean Kiefer, he was a French guy, builds the first tomography unit while lying in a hospital bed. He thought about this. And then in 46, the significant event there I wanted to highlight was John Caffey, that he was the kind of the first one to come up with a system of diagnosing child abuse, looking for evidence of child abuse using plain film. So Elizabeth Fleischmann, she is considered a martyr to radiation. She was actually the only woman listed there was a journal publication in 1936 that listed all the people that they knew of that had worked with radiation and in attempts to study it and to help people through X-rays died from it. She's the only woman that's in that publication. She worked with the Army and was a radiographer, so she was helping military men and women, mostly men, that were had combat wounds and such. So she died. Her hands were the first things that there was evidence that she was seeing ill effects from radiation, and she did have a radiation-induced cancer. She had both of her arms amputated, but it was too late. Her radiation poisoning was way too far gone by the time they tried to help her with that. There to the left there, that's an X-ray, a picture of an X-ray that she herself actually took, because back then it was actually common. Those who did radiography took pictures of people's feet in their shoes. So that's, hey, how else are you going to look at your feet inside your shoes? So pretty cool. Next, we'll talk about Hollis Potter. He was an inventor of sorts that improved upon Bucky's grid. He was the first to come up with this feature and design a grid that oscillated, so that back then what he thought he was doing was, in oscillating the Bucky, he thought he was removing what he called vagabond rays from the remnant beam. Excuse me. And obviously today, with our knowledge of radiation physics, we understand that to be scatter radiation, and also some of the X-rays that diverge very much so from the central ray, that actually do degrade the resolution of the image. But vagabond rays, that's what he called them back then when they didn't understand things like scatter and beam divergence and all that. So the neat thing about his oscillating feature, Bucky feature, was that it did actually help him not just improve the resolution of the radiographs when it was used, but it also helped to increase the plate size that they were able to use because of the increase in geometric resolution and exactness. They found that they were able to use bigger plates because there was such a marked increase in resolution and quality. So that's kind of neat. Prior to that, I think I read like 5 inches by 4 inches, something crazy. It was very, very small, because anything bigger than that, the image outside of that area was very, very poor quality. So let's talk about Arthur Mutscheller. He, if you trace modern day dosimetry all the way back as far as you can, you'll run into a guy named Arthur Mutscheller. He was the first to try and implement actually tracking radiation dose exposure to people like technologists and radiologists. He actually was working to help protect doctors from lawyers, believe it or not, because back then, because they didn't know a whole lot about what was safe and what wasn't safe as far as dose amounts to X radiation, doctors had a lot of trouble with lawsuits. And so they had to establish somehow a bar, a standard, a threshold of what is safe and what is not safe. So Arthur was trying to determine how much radiation can someone be exposed to, and we reasonably couldn't expect there to be some sort of effect from that. So that was basically, it was a very difficult thing for him to do. It's hard to establish dogmatically that, that you're not going to see any negative results from a particular amount of radiation. We understand that today. Stochastic effects, there's just no guarantee that even though there's, deterministic effects where certain amounts of radiation, definitely you can expect to see redness of the skin and so forth. Below that, maybe there are no short-term effects, but there's no guarantee that there's not going to be some sort of damage in the future. A cancer that pops up, you can't actually prove that wasn't from X radiation dose. So anyway, he did though begin the practice of helping people to keep track of how much dose they were getting, and he reinforced the idea that patients, doctors, technologists should be making sure that they should be getting the lowest dose possible, kind of that ALARA idea in its infancy. So yes, let's move on. Gene Kiefer is a really interesting, he's a really interesting guy. So he worked at a hospital that had a TB ward in it, and surprise, he himself got tuberculosis. And he, as an inpatient, had chest radiographs done, and his TB manifested itself mostly in his mediastinum, which is difficult to visualize on a regular chest radiograph because, obviously the spine, the sternum, the hilum, everything is kind of just all jumbled right there, and his TB was not out in the parenchyma of the lungs. So hard to visualize his pathology. So he was laying in his bed thinking about how in the world can I actually take an X-ray radiograph of my TB. And he kind of designed there on the hospital bed in his head an idea of how to actually move the tube and not detector, film plate, in a way that would actually blur the surrounding anatomy, and it would put into highlight a particular area, in his case the mediastinum. So just like what we use today in like an IVP, say, when we do a tomogram. So it's funny though, his idea worked. He was able to produce very diagnostic and good images in this way, but he couldn't get any of the companies to build it. So it's funny though, his idea came so long ago, and much later was kind of that idea was used in conjunction with computed tomography ideas to actually create what we have today in CT, because that's the idea. You've got the spinning, the tube and the receptor. So last person, I believe it's the last one for this particular time frame, is John Caffey. He was an interesting guy because he was a physician who started out as a pediatrician and then turned into a radiologist, which I've never heard of that nowadays, because people just don't do that. But because of his experience both in pediatrics and in radiology, he was able to use his knowledge and experience to come up with ways of looking at child abuse using radiography. He was able to kind of document the telltale signs of abuse, particular fractures, and he also had the shaken baby syndrome theory that wasn't able to be proved yet until MRI came along later. But really neat that he was able to kind of start that idea that one of the first lines of defense for a child who is a victim of abuse is, in the hospital, is radiography, because we can see fractures and injuries that are unique to kids that have been victimized in that way. Okay. Second half of the 20th century, we got in 56. Also about kids. Alice Stewart links pediatric cancers to prenatal radiation exposure. In 68, we've got Hounsfield coming out with his scanning method, and he's able to have that patented and equipment sold through EMI. In 1975, not that long afterwards, we've already got the third generation of CT scanners, which are marketed and sold by GE. In 1989, helical scanners, CT scanners, come out and are being used and marketed. And then in 1995, we see that MRI high field magnets hit the market and are shown as the anatomic powerhouses that they are. So Alice Stewart was an epidemiologist, and she was the first to kind of correlate the idea that abdominopelvic obstetric x-rays were actually causing harm to kids. So pediatric cancers that happened back then that were suspected to be caused by X radiation, she was able to correlate that and communicate that to the right people. And because of Alice Stewart, the practice of doing X-rays routinely or just in cases where the obstetrician was concerned about the baby or the mom, doing X-rays on those patients started to cease because of her, which is pretty cool. And luckily too, ultrasound came along and was able to replace eventually any need for that sort of thing. Well, not all of it, because sometimes we do have to do CT or X-ray on pregnant patients, but it's usually not to look. It's usually not to look at the baby. So anyway, Thank you, Alice Stewart. Sir Godfrey Hounsfield, pretty hard not to talk about him in a discussion about radiology history. He was the first person to kind of combine all of the ideas and disciplines of computed tomography into one working unit. So, you know, you've got computers, and he was one of the experts on computation and working with computers, which was rare in his time. You've got mathematical algorithms, you've got hardware, you've got all kinds of working components that have to all come together to create a CT image. And he was kind of the jack of all trades that was able to put all these things together, and he was in the right place at the right time. Had a company, EMI, that was able to take his idea, his patent, and actually create a working CT scanner. It was just for heads originally, but obviously it exploded from there. So the cool thing about CT, it was the first time that anybody was able to start imagining anatomy in more than one plane. You know, because obviously when you've got a slice of information rather than just a whole composite, whether it's AP or lateral or whatever, you're able to look at the anatomy in a different way that shows it more so as a three-dimensional object, because that's exactly what it is. So that's pretty cool. Only 7 years later, there's already the third generation that of CT scanners that came out. GE was the main company that came out that year to market its third generation CT scanners. We went from kind of the crude rotate, translate CT scanners that only did heads to now in the third generation, we've got scanners that do not translate, they only rotate, and they use a curved array so that the detectors are actually better utilizing the geometry of the beam as it is, the fan beam, as it would be like an X-ray. So it's not a pencil beam anymore. We've got a whole fan, a beam that's a larger fan, so that we can actually get more anatomy in per acquisition as well. So huge improvement in a very short time with third generation CT scanners. And then later on, we see that helical CT scanners come out, which is, you know, that's it's almost what's the word? It's cliche, because nowadays we use helical scanners so much. It's anything different than that, less than that, is kind of obsolete, honestly. You know, with the advent of the slip rings, we could acquire volumes of tissue rather than just one slice at a time. In one breath hold, you can do the whole chest or the whole belly, which was super revolutionary. And because of that, because it's so fast, you know, CT is it's ubiquitous with emergency imaging now. If you want the most amount of information at the shortest amount of time, you do CT. And the amazing thing too with how computers were keeping up with all of that advancement is that now we can scan the patient in one plane, in the axial plane, and then we can also reconstruct with that volumetric data multi-planar reformats. So we can do coronals, we can do sagittals, and the radiologist and the ordering physician can look at that patient's anatomy in whatever plane they want to. Last thing is from this particular time frame is the advent of high field MRI. It came onto the scene in a big way in the 90s. And just to reiterate what high field is, that's anything from 1 or 1.5 Tesla to 3 Tesla magnets. And I am not an MR tech, but you know, we've learned a lot about that this semester, and this semester and prior, kind of always have known how amazing MRI is, but that's kind of been reinforced this semester. The resolution, the detail, just the sheer size amount of information is just amazing. And the other things too that we can do with MRI, like functional MRI. I was a test patient one time for that, and that's pretty amazing that you can map out the activity in the brain, and the high field MRI is where it's at. You need that magnet strength to do that, and breath hold sequences. So abdominal MRI prior to this was not really, it just was no good. So they didn't really do it. But with the high field strengths, you can do abdominal MRI because you can do a breath hold sequence. That's possible. Okay, wrapping it up. At the turn of the century there, the 21st century to present, we've got the advent of direct digital X-ray detectors, flat panels. Those came in a big way in the 2000s, and then in 2012 we saw internationally the first inaugural day of radiology as it was instituted, which we actually celebrated that here very recently. So flat panel detectors, for those of us that are still in practicing doing radiography, that's our bread and butter. We use digital detectors to do absolutely everything. We only need one now. There's only one size that we use, which is kind of, even to me today, still is kind of odd, but because it would be nice to have small ones every once in a while. The cool thing about the flat panel digital detectors is that they're just so insanely fast. Anyone who has used the old film and CR both, but especially film, the processing time after you actually do the exam, it takes time. And with the flat panel detectors, there is no processing time. Not really. There's a digital process that happens almost instantaneously, but compared to the wet and dry processing that we used to have to do with film and CR, it's basically nothing. So that's been a huge help as far as speeding up radiography. Yeah, you guys know all about that, don't you? So rescaling is something that the computer does after the information is sent to it from the detector, and it gives us real pretty images. But I just kind of wanted to hit real quick on the idea that technically our dose with DR should be less than what it was with CR. I work with technologists that are older and haven't necessarily adopted DR techniques. They don't really understand that there's a huge sensitivity difference between digital and CR. So they want to use the lower KVs and the higher masses that they would have used on CR, and they don't need to do that. Their EI numbers are too high, but the image looks fine because the rescaled image looks the same as any other, as long as it's not grossly overexposed. It looks pretty similar to an EI that's in the normal range. So anyway, just a little side note there. Our doses should be lower with DR than they were with CR for actually the just as diagnostic of an image. Something interesting about the flat panel detectors and the digital X-ray is that the Affordable Care Act actually sped up the adoption that the hospital systems had of this, because Medicare patients, we would get reimbursed to a higher rate with the digital detectors because the dose was lower. Hospital systems realized that they needed to adopt that digital equipment sooner rather than later if they wanted to make the most money on their exams. Last bit here is on the International Day of Radiology. So most of us know that's November 8th every year. That's the day that Rinken is credited as discovering X-rays and creating that, that iconic X-ray of his wife's hand. We celebrate that as a way to look back on our history, kind of like what we're doing at this project. And it coincides for us here in the United States with Radiologic Technology Week, RadTech Week, where we can celebrate the contributions that we have made as a whole to the health community, and look back on all these things. It's amazing how far we've come in 150 years only. You think about someone could be alive today that's 100 years old, had a chest x-ray as a newborn, but there was nothing else in existence as far as other modalities. And now today you've got everything from, MRI and ultrasound to PET CT and, you name it, radiation therapy, all kinds of stuff that we didn't have 100 years ago, let alone, the computer software capabilities like we have in CT and MRI. So it's pretty amazing to look back at our rich history. So here's my reference list. And I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. And again, thank you for this semester. Hope you all learned a lot and enjoyed this semester like I did. Thank you. Bye.